Hello, welcome back. Welcome back. Okay, so today we're going to talk about a really interesting topic. Well, this is actually potentially really foundational for what the Qualia Research Institute is doing this year, and that is, well, going from neural activity to field topology and back. Essentially, how coupling kernels can shape consciousness. This is a very important topic because it's based on a lot of research at QRI, a lot of our retreat outputs, our research outputs, and it's something that is essentially guiding a lot of our strategy for where to invest the resources in order to, understand consciousness, understand how to modulate it, develop neurotechnology, even tackle things like chronic pain, or how to induce beautiful kind of like meditation states in a accelerated but healthy and wholesome way. So, it's very, very central to kind of like a lot of the ways in which we're thinking about consciousness these days. And for that reason, these will probably be kind of like a big overview, a conversational, casual, in a sense, overview of this whole topic. And there's going to be a lot more content about this in a lot of different ways, from simulations to technology to actual presentations in academic venues. So before I get started, I want to point out, yes, to carry me through the quality of the day is Rose Tulsi, Tulsi Sweet Rose, caffeine-free herbal tea. It's quite delicious. I mean, it really definitely does have kind of like a rosy quality. And if you know me and my tastes in scent qualia, you will know that, yes, some of my all-time favorites include, bergamot and rose. And so I love rose tea as well as Earl Grey because of the bergamot component. Um, yeah, I mean, rose is beautiful for a lot of reasons. In particular, it has kind of this phenyl ethyl alcohol component, which is kind of like remarkably soft in a way that is kind of the synesthetic equivalent of, effectively the kind of like feathery or the very, very soft aspect of a rose petal. Um, yeah, that, but in the scent domain. Okay, so anyway, I recommend Tulsi Sweet Rose for you to try. The other thing I want to mention, and this is very important, is that we're revamping our the Qualia Research Institute Discord, and so I'm actually going to be doing a live Q&A in 2 days from now. So today is February 20th. So on February 22nd, which is a Saturday, at noon Pacific time, I'm going to be doing a Discord live Q&A. So I'm going to add a link in the description, essentially the Discord invite. And, I recommend joining. You will, essentially find like-minded individuals. And I know there's a lot of really cool, interesting people here in this community, people who watch these videos and comment. I'm often, quite overjoyed with the fascinating content of the comments that you guys provide, whether it is spontaneous trip reports or object level analysis of what I'm talking about, or just like nice encouragement. I all of it I very much appreciate it. And in the Discord, I think like it's a place where we can actually kind of like start building a long-term community here. If you don't follow me on Twitter yet, well, I recommend you do. Not that you should get Twitter. That's not necessarily good for your for your mental health and long-term productivity. But if you already have a Twitter account, definitely follow me on Twitter. I'm Alge Calypso. X .com, I guess, like formerly Twitter. We also actually have like a Facebook group. Which a lot of kind of like OG people, and it's called Qualia Computing Networking, and we do have a bit of a kind of like entry bar. So we definitely ask that you answer the questions, to be admitted into the club, as it were. Essentially to keep the conversation, very high quality and actually build a community of people who like actually really passionate about this and know quite a bit about this. So, community announcements. Okay, so I have been kept quite busy in a number of fronts. I've been traveling a lot. I went to Amsterdam in January for about 2 weeks in collaboration with people from the Cyberdelic Nexus. And I'm going to mention them, by name at the end of the video. But, we have a recording of a presentation I gave in Amsterdam. I mean, essentially about new research paradigms for making sense of psychedelic states of consciousness in a quantitative algorithmic way. So expect a video about that. It's gonna be, I think it's really high quality, that one in particular, because it's very professionally recorded, and I thought the content was particularly good as far as QRI content is concerned. I worked very hard on making that presentation really, really high quality for you to learn a lot. Also, earlier this week, I actually had a podcast with Kurt from Theories of Everything in YouTube, and that's going to come out, I believe, in a week or two. So definitely be in the lookout for that. I also recorded last week a conversation with Joshua Bach, who is, essentially currently, he's a famous computationalist and a very, very bright guy. And also, I really, really like him as a friend. Very, very sensitive soul. And really appreciated that conversation. And that's also going to come out pretty soon. And more content, also recorded a video with Carl Hayden-Smith and other people essentially in kind of like the sphere of people who are essentially trying to formalize the study of psychedelics and taking them very seriously in legal and ethical ways. We recorded some content in Amsterdam. So anyway, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. We've been busy doing a bunch of other things as well. I will actually just mention very quickly. We also recently published a very thorough analysis of essentially this ethical tragedy, which is cluster headaches, and the potential for DMT to effectively abort and prevent future cluster headaches. And we think that, as far as, reducing suffering at scale, this is probably one of the top interventions. And the reason why in effective altruism this is not taken more seriously is because the loss function, the way that optimization, cost prioritization, triage is done, is by trying to maximize quality adjusted life years, or at least reduce the amount of quality adjusted life years that is lost because of different medical conditions, not by making a good faith effort to actually quantify suffering. Because if you do that and then you try to reduce suffering as much as possible, then all of a sudden the exponential nature of the intensity of suffering as a function of kind of the reported value in a pain scale actually becomes really relevant. So anyway, it turns out that if you want to minimize suffering, you shouldn't try to minimize the kind of like average pain score. No. You need to actually raise the pain, use the pain scores as an exponent, in an exponential scale, and then try to minimize, the expected value of, the aggregate of all of those values, which essentially, to the extent that you care about suffering specifically, it turns out that it prioritizes the extreme levels of suffering out there. DMT seems to be really effective for aborting cluster headaches. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it might be one of the, if not the most cost-effective way of reducing suffering in the world, if we figure out how to legalize and bring access to this therapy to people worldwide who suffer from this condition. If I leave a legacy of my life, as it were, and the work at QRI, and it's that, I would be very satisfied with what I have done in the world. So, please, support us in any way you can. We're going to be writing an open letter to essentially push for legislation in this domain. And yeah, donations, moral support, signing the letter, etc. All of that super, super welcome. At the same time, also, just this week, yeah, with Alfredo Parra, somebody who I've been collaborating with at QRI, we also released an analysis of kidney stones and how chanca piedra, which is a South American herb, as a preventative, as a prophylactic, may also be one of these like ridiculously good kind of like top interventions for minimizing suffering. So, yeah, if you're at risk of kidney stones, and most people are, in some places in the world, the incidence is going as high as 25%, lifetime prevalence. Yeah, actually, probably taking chanca piedra in a preventative fashion, maybe once a week, might actually be a massively cost-effective way of reducing suffering. Okay, so those are, yeah, some kind of like important announcements, community-wise, ethics-wise, the big picture. Now, let's get on to the content. So the title of this video, is the same title as the latest Qualia computing post, which is From Neural Activity to Field Topology. And there's quite a bit of content to go through. And I'm just gonna go, one point after another. And there's essentially 10 points. And I'm gonna explain them. Okay, so, before I kind of like dive into the details, I just wanna say, the very, very big picture here is, I think, that this paradigm might be able to explain why different substances produce radically different effects in consciousness, where it's not only a matter of like, well, this substance makes, your visual field more bright, or like this one makes it a little bit wavy or something like that, but it's like, no, like, why is there such a thing as like DMT, quote unquote, the spirit molecule that you take and you feel fragmented into 1,000 different components, and it sort of like feels that you're contacting other realms and other entities, or embodying other entities inside you, etc., etc. And then there's a completely different experience by an analog, very similar molecule called 5-amino DMT, which they call the God molecule, which if you consume, if you vaporize and consume, it gives rise to kind of this profound feeling of undeniable oneness, as it were, and an extreme simplicity, and kind of like getting in touch with a ground of being, and this sense of profound simplicity mixed with profound intensity. Very, very extremely different experiences by just tweaking a molecule a little bit. So what's going on? Okay, so at a very, very high level picture here is that we think that different substances might be modulating through a complicated, ultimately, but tractable causal chain, the coupling dynamics of oscillators in the body, in particular something like electric oscillators, although I actually will leave that kind of like somewhat agnostic about what exactly is oscillating in the body, but things would fit pretty well if it turns out it's modulating kind of macroscopic electric oscillations, which in turn, because of things such as like the right hand rule of electromagnetism, electric oscillations cause vortices in the magnetic field. And because, as we hypothesized at QRI, this is actually something I came up with a good number of years ago, and we have published in academia. We suspected that the phenomenal boundaries, what distinguishes one person from another, is the topology of the electromagnetic field, effectively creating looping structures that have an inside and an outside with actual kind of like holistic causal effects, something that evolution would have a reason to recruit, for causal reasons, for information processing reasons. In other words, we all of a sudden have a story for how is it possible that different substances can modulate, not only neural activity, but field topology, the boundaries inside you and outside of you, the way in which you're connected to the universe. So it's really profound. I mean, it really cuts to kind of these very deep ontological questions of like what separates you from the rest of the universe, and why something like a drug would actually mess with that, which is kind of incredible, right? It's like, the reported effects of something like 5-MeO DMT are just not credible unless you have actually experimented with the substance, or you trust whoever actually is reporting. It just sounds too extraordinary, too extreme. How can a drug do this? Okay, so we're going to explain it. We're going to explain it, or at least provide an outline of a conceptually satisfying, set of building blocks that build up to something that makes sense, hopefully. So, okay, the first thing that I want to say is talk about the coupling kernel. Okay, so what is a coupling kernel? This is something that came up when I was trying to come up with a way to interact with systems of coupled oscillators in a reliable, predictable way, without having to kind of like train sophisticated neural networks as control systems or mechanisms, or really, for that matter, to kind of like hard code specific geometries of the network for particular control systems. Like, no, I wanted a way of interfacing with a system of coupled oscillators that was very natural and very, very bottom up, but reliable and predictable. So what I ultimately arrived at by coding dozens of systems of coupled oscillators and trying to wire them in different ways, was the first thing that really emerged as kind of like something that had a clear utility and clearly was kind of like starting to replicate some psychedelic phenomenology to some extent, was Kuramoto oscillators. And I'm not going to get into the mathematical details there, although it's not very complicated, but I don't think it is necessary for this conceptual kind of like overview. And then geometrizing them. Okay, so in a traditional kind of like system of coupled oscillators, at least in the classic formulation of Kuramoto oscillators, what you have is kind of like an all-to-all relationship, where like every oscillator is connected with every other oscillator, and then they're all trying to be in phase with each other. You see, and when they're out of phase with each other, there's kind of like an error. They're all kind of like moving around in a circle, or you could even think of it as, for example, like metronomes in a table or something like that. Maybe they're like tuned to slightly different natural frequencies. Okay, so they actually want to oscillate at slightly different speeds, so to speak, but because they all belong to the same table, they're all on the same ground, as it were, there's tiny vibrations that are actually shared between them. And then what happens is that with those tiny vibrations, they are kind of like pulling and pushing each other. And so when they're out of phase, the more out of phase they are, the more there's kind of like a correcting, mechanism that is realigning them. So in the classic formulation of Kuramoto systems, they're all connected to each other and equally connected. And then there's some fascinating mathematics that you can show analytically. There's like some convergence conditions that under certain circumstances all of the oscillators actually click together, as it were, or they all kind of end up being dragged along by what's kind of the mean of the phase of all of the oscillators. That's a really interesting system, and again, like, what's nice about it is very tractable. It is not even trying to kind of accurately model some physical systems of oscillators. It's more kind of like a mathematical abstraction that just works very nicely. But in the realm of phenomenology, we're talking about these very complex networks. Like your visual cortex, your vasculature, your somatosensory cortex. You have a lot of different networks and connected in different ways, and so it's not the case that all of the oscillators are connected to each other. that is not like the wiring, right? So instead, it's actually some kind of like geometric embedding. All of these oscillators are in some kind of geometric space, and then whether they're two oscillators are connected or not is kind of like a function of their distance. In some simple systems, and most of the simulations in this particular context are like that. They're kind of like toy models for explanatory purposes. there might be like a simple rule, something like, if two oscillators are within a certain distance, then there is a connection between them. And if they're further away than that distance, then they're not connected. So in that way, you can kind of like represent a geometric space in terms of some kind of like connectivity between systems of coupled oscillators. Well, what I kind of like stumbled upon by playing with these systems was, well, maybe we can actually modulate what's called the coupling constant between oscillators at different distances. And maybe that way we can gain some control over kind of like the overall, emergent oscillations that happen at the macroscopic level. And so, it looks something like this, where, okay, let's see if this works. Yeah. I mean, in some of the simulations that you will see, for any given oscillator, if you look at oscillators at distance 1 from it, especially if it's let's say a square lattice, there's going to be 4 oscillators at that distance. And so there's a lever that, depending on the value that you set it up at, is going to modulate a positive or negative coefficient for the coupling constant for oscillators at that distance. In this case, there's going to be just 4. I guess, for clarity, or for those who are curious, this is called Manhattan distance, which is you sort of like add up independently kind of like the distance in the x-axis and the y-axis. They call it Manhattan distance because it's sort of like the number of blocks that you would have to kind of go from one place to another in a city grid, So you don't care about like kind of like the diagonal distance. You care about like the streets and avenues added together. And then at a distance 2, from this, let's say, intersection, it starts to actually form kind of like a diamond shape, where now you have like 8 oscillators at distance 2, and there's going to be a lever that modulates the coupling constant to those 8 oscillators. And then there's going to be 12 at distance 3, and 16 at distance 4, and so on and so forth. So the central idea of a coupling kernel is a system of levers that modulate the coupling constant of the oscillators for each of those different, Manhattan distances. Well, it doesn't have to be Manhattan. This is just in a square grid. If we're talking about a 3D continuous space, and a lot of our simulations are like that, then, it can be Euclidean distance. It can also be like distance in other geometries. It could be on the surface of a sphere. It could be in a hyperbolic space. This is very general. But, for the sake of simplicity, in a square lattice, we're talking about, x plus y in terms of like the streets and avenues. Well, if you play with this system, you will kind of like realize that, and this is the second point, or point 1. Point 0 is what is a coupling kernel. Point 1 is in the article, coupling kernels as neural global bridges. So let me get here. Well, even before I go there, I'm going to explain briefly what a small world network is, because there's another lever that we usually also include. At the beginning of a simulation, essentially what we do is, like, for every given oscillator, we choose 2 other oscillators at random in the entire grid, and we wire them to it. And then the small world lever is going to be modulating effectively the coupling constant to those 2 at random, which, I mean, it's effectively is a random network. And we call it small world because, this is what is very well known, that like the social distance between people, it's actually pretty small on average, between you and the Queen Elizabeth, I mean, the classic example, or, anybody in the world. Chances are, somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows that person. Like the number of hops that you need to take between you and that person usually doesn't go above 6. There's such a thing that is called the diameter of a graph, which is like what is the the longest, the shortest path. Essentially, what is the pair of nodes such that the shortest path is the longest? That is the diameter of a graph. And what happens is that, yeah, if you have a kind of this network that is geometric, where nodes are connected to their neighbors or neighbors within a certain distance, the diameter is very large, because you actually have to kind of like walk in that world, embedded in a geometric space. And maybe in the medieval time, or earlier, before there were kind of like these long roads or like long distances that people were traveling, yes, the social distance between individuals was like pretty large in a way, but not anymore. No, I mean, there was kind of like a threshold in social evolution where enough people were kind of like making long trips that is effectively kind of like adding this random network on top of a geometric network. And when you do that, then you shrink the diameter. And you turn it into a small world. So you don't actually need many random connections. There's kind of like a threshold, a percentage of random connections where the diameter completely collapses, and then like everybody is right next to everybody else. So that's one important kind of like a way of modulating the activity of the system of coupled oscillators, is adding this small world network, which is effectively a way of either scrambling the activity when the coupling coefficient is negative in the small world network, or a way of synchronizing everybody when it is positive. But you don't have to worry about it. That's just kind of like a hack to significantly increase the state space of configurations accessible with this lever system. But let's just like focus for a moment on actually just the geometric components, the coupling 1, coupling 2, coupling 3, and 4. And early on, one thing that I did was apply what is called a discrete cosine transform on this system, even just on a flat system. And as you can see in the article, what happens is that, well, the discrete cosine transform is kind of like a Fourier transform. I mean, effectively what you're doing is like showing in what way kind of like waves of different spatial frequencies. I mean, I guess for context, for those who don't know, a wave with a low spatial frequency is kind of like a wave that is very large. A wave with a high spatial frequency is a very kind of like intricate, detailed wave. Okay, so it turns out that you can essentially tune into global resonant modes of the entire system of coupled oscillators by just modulating the coefficients of the coupling kernel. Like what is the coupling of coupling 1, 2, 3, and 4. This was to me very intuitive, but then it turns out that you can actually rigorously prove this to be the case with techniques from a field that's called a spectral graph theory, where you effectively kind of like apply filters on a graph for kind of like different distances. I'm not going to bore you with the technicalities, but effectively what's called the various powers of the Laplacian of the system effectively will be modulating the amplitude for different resonant modes of different spatial frequencies. And so it turns out that we just kind of like stumbled upon this way of modulating the amplitude of the energy for waves of different spatial frequencies, which it's actually kind of mind-blowing, because systems of coupled oscillators, they're considered these very complex systems. They're considered these very intractable, hard to predict dynamic systems. And the fact that you can actually tune into global resonant modes of them just by modulating the amplitude of a coupling kernel is utterly fascinating. It gives you a handle with predictable effects and predictable resonance effects that are holistic and global of the entire brain, or the entire graph in this case, by just kind of like modulating the amplitude on levers. So that was pretty mind-blowing and pretty important for me, kind of like a milestone really, in kind of like how to make sense of complex, systems of coupled oscillators. And well, it turns out that I'm not the first one to realize this. In fact, down the line, actually November of last year at a work retreat in Tepoztlan, with other people at QRI, yeah, we encountered a paper by Marco Aquil, who I went to his thesis defense and he presented at the Amsterdam QRI meetup. So thank you very much. And that was actually super awesome. This is his thesis, which he defended last month, his PhD thesis called Levels of Vision, which, he touches upon some of these. There's another key piece of the puzzle, which is called divisive normalization, which I'm going to explain in a moment. But he developed a method called chaos, with two S's, which effectively is a way of analyzing the resonant modes of a brain in terms of modulating kind of something that is very mathematically equivalent to something like a coupling kernel, although he doesn't call it exactly that way. But to me, that was kind of like mind-blowing. It was like, oh my gosh, actually in academia, they're arriving at something quite similar from a very different perspective, because from our perspective, we're taking, phenomenology seriously. We're trying to replicate the features of different, exotic states of consciousness by using like, graph theory and dynamic systems and so on. And in this case, they're primarily actually not so much actually trying to replicate phenomenology. They're trying to replicate psychophysical measurements and neuroscientific measurements, neuroimaging data sets, empirical. So it is kind of like the objective, scientific measurements of the brain from a third-person perspective, all of a sudden arriving and converging into very similar ideas and very similar models to QRI, who is effectively kind of like championing taking phenomenology seriously and, bringing, advanced meditators and physicists and mathematicians and visual artists to, depict and make sense of exotic states of consciousness. And so, yeah, chaos effectively, kind of like converges in very similar ideas. So just to recap, coupling kernels are kind of this bridge between neural activity and kind of like global activity. Now, the other thing, which is very relevant from Marco, is divisive normalization. It's a paradigm that he worked on. I don't think he developed, although he invented, but like he definitely has kind of like developed and furthered quite a bit. And that is this notion that the probability for a given oscillator in the brain, populations of neurons, not individual neurons, but essentially populations of neurons, to kind of like oscillate, is a function of both the kind of like sensory inputs that go into them and the activity in the surrounding of them, especially when you have kind of this like layered system where you have like several layers of neurons, where there's kind of like intra-layer connections, lateral connections, as it were, and then connections between the layers. Divisive normalization is effectively a mathematical technique to explain how the activity of one layer triggers activity in the next layer. And then, you can repeat that over and over. And the really cool thing here, without making, precise claims or connections between the parameters of the divisive normalization and effects of different substances, although we want to get there, we're not there, but like we want to get there, and we're crafting studies to eventually actually be able to get there and publish about that. But, just conceptually, I think this is conceptually sound, that all of a sudden the picture starts to become crisp, where you have kind of this low level, what they call canonical computation, this low level method for making sense of how like contextual activity in populations of neurons translates, into things like traveling waves and dynamic system behavior, which then through something like a coupling kernel or chaos can be understood as these like global resonant modes of the entire system. And so oh my gosh, the brain starts to look more tractable. It starts to make more sense. And so, um, I think that's wonderful. Like I highly recommend, yeah, diving into divisive normalization and chaos in Marco Akil's work. He's building on top of also work by Morten Kringelbach and Selen Atasoy, um, um, and that whole kind of like tradition of, in a sense, making sense of the brain as a dynamic system with turbulent processes and resonant modes. It's starting to cash out into things that are very concrete and maybe even insightful at the level of phenomenology. Okay, so the next point is geometric constraints as modulators for coupling effects. So this is more uniquely kind of QRI as reflection or insight. And as you will see, if you have this kind of like hierarchical system of coupled oscillators, like in the visual cortex, a particular coupling kernel will have predictable effects. But those effects are going to be somewhat different than if the network topology and geometry is more simple, like just a simple grid, for example. So the main point I want to kind of like highlight in this context is how the network architecture comes together with a coupling kernel in order to together give rise to the emergent dynamic effects that take place. In other words, maybe a substance is effectively modulating the coupling kernel, but then the effect that it has in the body, in your consciousness, depends on the network geometry, the network architecture that it is affecting. And one very important kind of like takeaway from this point is that a psychedelic effect, the effect of LSD, let's say the effect of mescaline, the effect of DMT, etc., may actually be very simple. It may be through a process of divisive normalization that it instantiates a coupling kernel, and then that affects different systems differently depending on its network architecture. But then it's very predictable. Let me give you an example. Like LSD affects your visual, phenomenology. It affects your audio phenomenology. It affects your tactile phenomenology. And there's something kind of similar about that. Like if you introspect on like, okay, like the body feeling on LSD is kind of the same vibratory tone, as it were, as what's happening in the visual field, right? But there's also differences. But there's similarities, right? So it would be just very parsimonious, Occam's razor. It would be very beautiful if we can explain that kind of like diversity of effects with just one simple kind of like coupling kernel induced by the substance. And ultimately it's not going to be that simple, because different systems will have like different divisive normalization and as a consequence different coupling kernels. But I do think that to a first approximation, we will be able to do something like characterize LSD in terms of a coupling kernel in a cross-modal fashion, meaning in a way that works the same in different sensory modalities and even different systems entirely. Like, for example, the cardiovascular system. I mean, that is one of the very fascinating things I've learned recently, that the vascular system is very active, and it's not just the heart. There's these smooth muscle cells that are essentially modulating the vasodilation and constriction, and they're serotonin mediated, with 5-HT1A and 5-HT2A as key neurotransmitters that modulate some of those, circuit level activity, which would cash out in terms of divisive normalization and as a consequence into coupling kernels. So we're developing effectively a paradigm for making sense of how waves, different types of waves, may be traveling in your cardiovascular system as a function of taking a particular substance. So anyway, to me, this is utterly mind-blowing and potentially massive explanatory power with just very simple principles, which is what we want in science, of course. Okay, but there's more. I recently made a video and I've written about this, this concept that we are calling projective intelligence. I recommend watching the video because there's a little bit more. We'll go into like more depth. Although in this video, it's kind of like gets contextualized within the overall recent paradigms that we're exploring at QRI. Well, the overall idea here is that a lot of what conscious intelligence is about is the interaction between fields with different dimensionalities and topologies. So there is a constant kind of like drive in your overall conscious system to sync up and reduce the kind of like error signals between your visual field and your tactile field. And I hope that makes sense, right? That like when you see something and you try to grab it, you're kind of like anticipating tactile sensations, right? Like you're anticipating a somatic feeling as a consequence of that movement. So in fact, and this is an insight that originally came from Roger Thiesel and Winston Brian Scott and Cube Flipper and Asher Arataki in the Canada retreat, QRI sponsored, and for researching meditation and exotic states of consciousness, that effectively, almost always, visual sensations are somatically tracked. That part of what allows you to have kind of like a visual working memory is that you associate and you anchor, visual qualia and geometry to tactile sensations. And maybe that is essential for object permanence. I've talked to people with autism, for example, who have difficulties with object permanence. And it might be because that connection is a little bit severed or broken and doesn't work entirely. That visual sensations are not necessarily super well tracked by somatic sensations. And of course, that's going to generate a lot of very strange kind of like errors and deficiencies, very hard to diagnose. But effectively, I would describe that as kind of like a failure mode of projective intelligence in this context, that visual sensations are not being somatically tracked in a proper way. And there's a bunch of things that must happen for that to be the case. The anticipation of somatic sensations must be finely tuned with the visual sensations. And then on top of that, projective transformations in the visual field. Like as you move around like a cup in your visual field, the same kind of like projective transformations in that visual field must, in some sense, correspond to projective transformations in the somatic field. And very crucially here, these have different dimensionalities, and the visual field to a first approximation is, like two-dimensional, it's kind of like this flat surface. And if you actually relax completely, in meditation, if you let go entirely in like jhana practice and you get absorbed into infinite space or infinite consciousness or, into universal consciousness, thank you, Asher, for this t-shirt, a very wonderful gift. Then actually your visual field becomes flattened, right? So in fact, embodiment, the feeling of being someone and somewhere, where you have like a depth to your visual field that requires some degree of somatic tension. So the main thing that I'm trying to communicate here is that there is an extraordinarily deep connection between the relationship between fields of different dimensionalities, like 2 dimensions in the visual field, 3 dimensions in the somatic field, and the intercoupling between those, the projection or mapping between those fields onto each other, and intelligence, conscious processing, the embodiment of a multisensory world. So now the next kind of like insight here, and it's still part of the same point, is that the way in which these different fields can talk to each other, we hypothesize, is by modulating the projection and the coupling kernel. And if you want to dive kind of like very deep into this particular hypothesis, I recommend reading our paper on meditative cessations. So it turns out that, if you meditate a lot, you go very deep into concentration, there are these like very special moments where everything disappears. This also happens in high dose 5-MeO DMT. And when everything disappears, what we're hypothesizing is happening is that you're finding a projection from one of these fields onto another, and also finding a coupling kernel, in both of those fields in such a way that the waves in each of those fields can interlock perfectly with each other and they look the same. And we have, yeah, like some honestly, yeah, quite beautiful simulations here of being able to kind of like rotate a three-dimensional lattice, effectively representing the resonant modes of a three-dimensional system, like the somatic field. And then also being able to kind of like look at a distance function that is on the screen, meaning that is 2D, effectively representing the geometry of the visual field. And then we show that there are particular projections, like for example, looking at the cube from one of the corners until it looks actually kind of like a hexagon, and particular combinations of coupling kernels in both the 3D space and the 2D space, where all of a sudden it's impossible to tell if the system is two-dimensional or three-dimensional. That is what we think is kind of these like very high valence, very blissful kind of like state of consciousness that lacks prediction errors, and therefore there's just no information content. In some sense, like there's nothing that is happening because everything is perfectly in sync. And it is, it's very difficult to actually find those states of consciousness because there's a combinatorial explosion of possible projections from one field onto another, and on top of that, a combinatorial explosion of possible combinations of coupling kernels. So a cessation would actually be a really special configuration. Like it would be the right coupling kernels and the right projection in such a way that the waves look the same in both. Yeah, I think that was an important insight that I had last year, and we formally wrote it up, and it's gonna, I think, keep explaining a lot of things. Like even things like reactivations on 5-MeO DMT that like they might involve kind of like priming the system to enter configurations where there's kind of this the right projection and the right coupling kernel such that like the waves look the same in different fields. Now, this is mostly analyzing, the visual system, the tactile system. Of course, there's also the auditory system, and there's like other fields as well. If you go, if you go by Shenzhen Young's kind of like carving of the state space of consciousness, qualia fields, there's at least kind of like these like 6 fields, which is inner and outer, see, hear, and feel. With, for example, feel has like the outer component, which is tactile sensations, and the inner component, which is emotions. There's also, of course, like, scent, ooh, rose, Tulsi. Scent qualia, and all of those, would essentially correspond to different dimensionalities, different geometries, and they would have different coupling kernels. And so a true cessation, does require a lot of fine tuning. It's not just the visual and tactile fields, although those may be some of kind of the principal components. Some of the things you absolutely need to get right, and then the other things might be more kind of like the details, perhaps. Okay, so the next point, where it starts to, in some sense, connect with metaphysics and big important solutions to problems in philosophy of mind, is the topological solution to the boundary problem. I'm not going to go very deep into these because I've talked a lot, I've talked at length about these, lots of articles and videos and, a peer-reviewed paper on these with Chris Percy as a collaborator. But what I'm going to say is that, if you start out with kind of like a field view of panpsychism, where the universe is a gigantic field of consciousness, then you have the boundary problem, which is, okay, if we're all one, if we're all this gigantic field of consciousness, how come you are there and I'm here? And we're kind of like different moments of experience, different perspectives. How is this possible? Aren't we all the same field? Well, the solution that we have here is that, the field is effectively something like a vector field where, there's kind of like arrows at every point. And there's many formulations here and many ways of arriving at field topology. But, this is a relatively simple one that aligns with the electromagnetic field. And, effectively, there are things you can do to the field that changes the topology of the field. In particular, with electric oscillations, you can essentially create like vortices in the magnetic field. And vortices in the magnetic field is just kind of the simplest example of how to create kind of like a change in the field topology. And there's many other ways of doing this. And I'm not married to any particular one. I just think there's going to be some field topology property. But vortices is a great kind of like entryway into like, okay, this is falsifiable and maybe even physically plausible. And the core idea would be something like, how like in the sun, you have kind of these huge flux tubes, these plasma tubes, it's not just kind of like a sphere, but you have these protuberances, right? And it's crazy that when a solar flare happens, or what's called a coronal mass ejection, when the sun kind of like spews, like millions of tons of hot plasma into outer space, that is the result of a topological transformation, a macroscopic topological transformation, which is very significant because most people tend to think, well, maybe topology matters at the microscopic level, maybe at the level of atoms and molecules. But what we're saying here is that the field topology actually has macroscopic top-down effects at the level of, the size of one of these coronal mass ejections, which is like much larger than, for example, the planet Earth. So massive things. And the way in which this happens is that, the flux tubes will be kind of like trapping plasma, but then if they touch, then the magnetic field lines exchange partners. And then when that happens, you essentially kind of like release these trapped plasma, which was what's called topologically confined by the shape of the field. Okay, so that is just kind of like a good example of the sort of thing that I suspect is happening in the brain, that the brain, at least some deep parts of it, perhaps the thalamus and the lateral nucleus together, maybe the thalamocortical loop, something deep and very fundamental for being awake or dreaming, I mean, effectively conscious, kind of like as a unified moment of experience. The macroscopic neural oscillations are causing these electric oscillations that result in looping structures in the electromagnetic field. And these looping structures, they're not epiphenomenal. The moment you actually make these looping structures and you trap energy, then you have the resonant modes inside these looping structures, and you have this holistic behavior. You have something that behaves as more than the sum of its parts, especially as I will touch upon in the end, if you add something like a path integral formulation of like what is going on with light and electrons moving around in these pockets. But even without that, you do have kind of this emergent, holistic, more than the sum of the parts behavior with objective boundaries that are causally significant. They have like computational properties, and we think that is what solves the boundary problem. That like these looping structures is what is creating an inside and an outside with kind of like an objective, clear boundary. Would be wonderful if this is the case, because it solves so many philosophical problems all at once. The next point is electromagnetic field topology modulation, which is if indeed something like the coupling kernel is modulating the way in which electric activity of these oscillators, the relative phase between them as a function of the distance, as you can see in some of these simulations, what happens is that you can use the coupling kernel not only to determine kind of like how sprinkly or how like uniform the traveling waves or the chaotic processes in kind of these like oscillatory dynamics are. You can also use the coupling kernel, and hear these very well, you can also use the coupling kernel to modulate the field topology. That if you apply kind of these like on-off center surround lateral inhibition type of coupling kernel, you may get lots of different vortices, or maybe kind of these nested structures of vortices that then are going to be trying to interact with each other and minimize the energy, which is what physics is always trying to do, but in this very exotic topology. Whereas, for example, if you make all of the oscillators go up and down at the same time, then instead, as a consequence, what you will have is just one gigantic vortex. or sometimes not even a vortex. I mean, especially if you have like a clear kind of like a boundary or like a circle, for example, and you have like this macroscopic coupling kernel that goes up and down all at once, that actually may raise the internal topology and make it entirely flat, which effectively maybe subjectively corresponds to complete ego dissolution, or complete emptiness. There's just no manufacturing of internal boundaries, maybe associated with kind of like a full, complete mystical experience, right? +4 in the Shulgin scale. So that is very important. Just to recap, you can modulate the electromagnetic field topology with a coupling kernel, which, okay, all of the pieces of the puzzle are starting to become assembled. Very exciting, right? Well, and importantly, the way in which the field topology will be modulated by a given kernel depends on the geometry of the network. So again, there's going to be some characteristic ways in which, the oscillations in the electromagnetic field will be tuning into field topologies, which is going to be different than what is happening in the somatosensory cortex or the visual field. All depend, even if you're using the same kernel, all depending on the particular network geometry of these subsystems. And of course, then where it becomes really non-trivial and fascinating is how they couple to each other, how they project onto each other, map onto each other. So yeah, this is where, okay, we might be really starting to get kind of like a lot of traction for like how a drug causes these crazy effects on the field in a reliable, predictable way, right? Like why, this is the next point, why 5-MeO DMT may actually be reliably something that, for example, causes topological simplification. And, I'm actually going to not go very deep into these because I don't want to bias you too much. I mean, there's like some studies that we want to run, and I don't want to give you sort of like exactly what is the answer that we expect. I don't think that matters all that much because most of the people who are going to be answering our surveys and studies, are not going to get to this part of the video and so on, but, I will give you kind of like the overall arching kind of like idea here, which I think has explanatory power. And that is, on 5-MeO DMT, oftentimes people report, yeah, maybe they become kind of this huge torus, right? Or sometimes they just become a point or just a big pinwheel, or sometimes like not even that. Maybe they feel kind of like all of their attention field lines, as it were, like become perfectly aligned or something like that. Well, that effectively maps onto something like a topological simplification process where you have like fewer vortices than you used to have. And there's going to be a characteristic kernel here. And what we want to find out and really write a research on this year is to see if we can square something like the divisive normalization low-level effects together with an understanding of the network geometry and topology of different subsystems in such a way that we can, predict and generate the same visual and tactile phenomenology that is actually reported by people who, have experience with 5-MeO DMT. Again, this would be amazing because it's like the marriage, even if it doesn't work out, right? Like even just as an, wide blue sky attempt at kind of like marrying, kind of like third person neuroscience and first person taking phenomenology seriously kind of like approaches, finally you have like one way of creating a bridge, even if the bridge is completely wrong. I mean, I still think it's very worth it, and it's very much a milestone, a new way of thinking of how to tackle this problem. Which, yeah, again, even if we're wrong, I still consider it a sort of accomplishment. Although, yeah, it's next level if we can actually make it work. The next point is just a little bit of kind of this observation that, if the coupling kernel effectively is tuning into specific field topology, then the field topology would have like top-down effects as well. So you're kind of like sculpting the field topology. I mean, it's kind of like, if you have like a river, which is maybe the laminar flow, so to speak, of the electromagnetic field, if you put a bunch of rocks in the river and you have kind of like foam and turbulence, you're effectively affecting the topology, you see, of the way the field lines, the laminar flow in the water is interacting with each other. And that has like top-down causal effects, right? Like if you can keep the flow of the water in the river perfectly laminar and kind of like parallel with each other, then you will have a certain kind of behavior for the river, and the river is going to be carving particular paths. Whereas if it's full of rocks and you get turbulence, then the paths that it's going to be generating is going to be different. Maybe it's going to branch out more. Well, I don't know. I'm not a geophysicist, but I think that's the sort of thing that you observe, that like if you add turbulence, the top down effects of the river are different, right? So and more so, it will feed into kind of like how the river in the future gets carved, and so you may discover more rocks, for example, that maintains the turbulence, or it may be self-defeating. Maybe turbulence generates laminar flow, which generates turbulence, which generates laminar flow, something along those lines. And so I strongly suspect that by modulating the field topology with a kernel, you then will modulate the kernel with field topology. And this connects with, essentially, the next level of what we call neural annealing, which we coined now as neural field annealing, where effectively, what happens when you do a lot of jhana meditation, these very concentration, blissful states of consciousness, is that you're tuning not only into kind of like a macroscopic oscillatory dynamic, you're tuning into a field dynamic, a wave function. You're tuning into ways for the field to evolve over time, and that has like top-down effects. And so I think kernels can therefore be used to tune into field topologies that then affect the kernels themselves, because of things like Hebbian learning. Neurons that fire together, they wire together. So the more you play with a particular kernel, the more you create a topology, a kernel consistent topology, which in turn will be reinforcing that kernel. And that might explain things such as, reactivation effects. Okay, the next point is, a little bit of a deeper dive into something like DMT and 5-MeO DMT. And, the main thing I want to drive home here is that, maybe the sense of, entities, the sense of, hey, DMT is kind of like an ecosystem of consciousnesses that might very well be a side effect of increased topological complexity. That, within the boundary, the topological pocket that you are of the field, if you have a bunch of vortices that effectively kind of like functions as different observers in the field, ultimately there's just one observer, and like, maybe open individualism is true in a certain sense, that we're all one, we're all the field, but the way in which sensations get rendered depends on the number of anchor points, or kind of like these pivots within the topology of the field. And every vortex is kind of a particular perspective for the rest of the field. And the field requires these perspectives, requires these anchor points to kind of be able to observe itself in a way that breaks the symmetry. Whereas, like topological simplification may, on the other hand, create this powerful feeling of kind of a superposition of all possible paths all at once. And I suspect that, classic Buddhist awakening and 5-MeO DMT maybe are much more related to that, related to topological simplification, where there isn't an anchor point. There isn't a sense of self that you can use to kind of like observe and break the symmetry of the field. If you can't break the symmetry of the field, you just have a superposition of all possible points of view at the same time. And this takes me to the last point, which is the path integral. How does light, find the shortest path? Or how does an electron, find the shortest path? When you have a Tesla coil, right? Like, and you're kind of like playing with it, and you put your finger close to it, like how does it know to actually touch your finger, right? Like, it's almost, Richard Feynman would put it as, it's almost as if the electrons can kind of like smell their surroundings in a way. And it is very non-trivial. This is a very, very fascinating topic, and it's complex. But I'm going to add a link in the description for a video that sort of explains how this happens. And, the very parsimonious way to explain this is that, well, actually electrons and light, they go through every possible path at once. It just so happens that most of them end up canceling each other out. Their amplitudes end up, for any given path, you can find like another path with kind of like equal, amplitude that cancels it out, except in what's called the extremes, which are like shortest paths and longest paths. saddle paths as well. I'm not going to get into, but it is fascinating that in fact, light very often doesn't only go through the shortest path; it also goes through the longest path. Something that you can observe, in a mirror room, for example. You will observe that yes, if there is a longest path that light can take, you will also see it take that path, which breaks a lot of intuitions, and you require something like this. And a path integral, I guess, for those who haven't heard this term, it means you're kind of like taking the integral of paths. So an integral is kind of like the area under the curve, and rather than, let's say, like the thing that you're computing is kind of like an area under the curve, you're kind of like computing the summation of all possible paths and their amplitudes. Well, I think this is actually the way also to explain one of the key causal roles of consciousness, that in the current QRI model, a moment of experience is actually kind of the superposition of all of the allowed paths within a topological pocket. And I think this is actually necessary to explain phenomenology, because oftentimes, like, let's say, for example, on LSD, you may find yourself in a situation where there's these very complex fractal structures that are happening, and then you kind of like see them from a certain angle, and everything collapses into just one point. Meaning that, in configuration space of neural activity, very complex fractal structures are right neighbors, to just point-like states of consciousness. And the only way in which I can make sense of this, especially taking phenomenal binding seriously, that like, hey, this is kind of like happening all at once, that all of those pieces of information are put together simultaneously. The only way I can make sense of that is that, it is something like, what is it like to be a particular person is what is the superposition of all possible paths within the pocket that is being carved out thanks to the oscillatory dynamics of, let's say, the electric field. And then what happens is that any kind of like symmetry breaking within that pocket is essentially kind of like observed from every point within that pocket. And so there's a lot of configurations, actually, especially when you're getting to kind of like fairly simple configurations, where you're going to have kind of these like infinite lattices, right? Because, I mean, think about it. Like if you're like in the surface of a torus, on the surface of a donut, and there's like one black spot somewhere, or maybe two black spots, just to make it more clear. And you look at that from a particular point, you may say like, oh, there's one black spot over there, there's one black spot over there. But if what's actually happening is you're kind of like the superposition of all of the possible points of view within the torus, you're going to see like kind of like an infinite grid. In some context, actually, you're going to see like a lattice of points. Not in this particular example, but in very similar examples. Or for example, like, yeah, if you think of like what is it like to be a cube, and you're looking at it from the point of view of a path integral, all possible perspectives within the cube. If the cube is perfectly symmetrical, it only has one corner, right? Because you cannot distinguish between the corners. But like, as you're approaching kind of this perfectly symmetrical cube, you will have like these multiple corners suddenly kind of like align and collapse into just one. And likewise, in the surface of a torus, the moment you actually remove these imperfections, these tiny defects in the field, then all of a sudden you just have like nothingness. Because you used to have kind of this like lattice of imperfections, this infinite lattice of how it looks like from every point of view at once. But then you remove that imperfection, and then boom, the whole thing collapses. Why? Because now every perspective looks the same. And so effectively, this might also be a way of arriving at something like the symmetry theory of valence by Mike in a rigorous bottom-up way, which is that if, hey, the nature of the universe is this kind of like maximum entropy path integral superpositions, then if you can actually achieve perfect symmetries, that entails, in fact, kind of like a collapsation of what it is like to be that, because every point of view within, a pocket that is perfectly symmetrical looks exactly the same. And so, yeah, very advanced jhanas and peak 5-MeO DMT experiences may be the result of simplifying the field topology to such an extent that all of a sudden all the perspectives within that pocket look exactly the same. Okay, so that is the very very big picture. I'm just gonna kind of like recap because I know it's a lot. Um, first of all, the coupling kernel, that it's a way of effectively controlling systems of coupled oscillators by modulating the coupling constant for oscillators at different distances. And coupling constant here is, hey, do you want to be in the same phase or opposite phase? What you want to be the same color or a different color. Then, we show that using a coupling kernel, you can modulate whole field resonant modes. So that's kind of like the neural to global bridge. And you can rigorously show this, and so you have kind of like this connection with maybe something like divisive normalization, going from the low level system architecture to global resonant modes, perhaps being able to explain empirical data like connectum specific harmonic waves on psychedelics, where you show, hey, LSD produces higher amplitude in the high frequencies, as well as just more energy overall. Then we have these kind of geometric constraints on coupling effects, that the effect that a given coupling kernel has is a function of not only the coupling kernel, but also the geometry and topology of the network that it is affecting, which is a very parsimonious way of maybe accounting for the zoo of effects of psychedelics. Then there is network geometry, interactions, and projective intelligence, how a lot of conscious processing may actually be about the way these different fields with different dimensionalities interact with each other and how they can couple together, they project, they map onto each other, and you modulate the coupling kernel in such a way that errors or prediction errors are minimized. Then in turn, there's the topological solution to the boundary problem, which we then connect with coupling kernels and how by modulating the coupling kernels in particular geometries, gives rise to global topological boundaries as well as local internal topological boundaries. And then in turn, these may account for perhaps the subjective differences between DMT and 5-MeO DMT and different psychedelics, maybe even ketamine. Ketamine, I didn't really touch upon it, but I suspect it's actually a temporal kernel. I'm not gonna go there, but maybe in a future video. And then finally, to wrap up all of these kind of perspectives, literally, we talk about the path integral of perspectives, that within a topological pocket, what is it like, what in Principia Qualia by Mike Johnson, it was defined as Qualia formalism, this idea that there are mathematical objects that map onto moments of experience and their phenomenology, that mapping, it's a new hypothesis by me and others at QRI, that like that mapping, the solution to Qualia formalism is through path integrals, that you have this field topology, and then to interpret that field topology as an experience, what you do is you superimpose all of the possible paths within it. And if you do that, then you have enormous explanatory power, and you may be able finally to really have an explanation for why substances that are so similar produce radically different effects. There are like mystical, in nature. Like, why does it feel like we're all one on 5-MeO DMT? Why does it feel like it's an ecosystem of intelligences on DMT? In summary, because different substances produce changes in the low-level circuitry, which causes different coupling kernels, which tune into different global resonant modes, which modulate the field topology, which in turn gets processed through different path integrals, and then you get the phenomenology. And finally, the last thing I will say here is that that global effect, that kind of like change in topology, then feeds back causally. So actually, the boundaries and the experiences that you have because of the path integral nature, they are really more than the sum of the parts. It's not a metaphor. It's not like in Conway's Game of Life or in a cellular automaton where you can kind of squint your eyes and think of it as more than the sum of the parts, but really the system is still just accounted for by these like low level interactions. Like, no. When you're talking about path integrals, you really truly have more than the sum of the parts in a completely non-trivial way. And that, my friends, is why we're conscious, because we're actually providing non-trivial computational leverage on biological organisms for their survival. But hopefully we can actually break free from the replicator imperative and essentially aim towards the values of consciousness, team consciousness. Okay, with that, I mean, I just want to say kind of like thank you to people who have been supportive recently. Especially there's like so many people to thank, of course, but like the director of operations, Hunter Meyer. None of these would be possible without him and his wife, Crystal. Um, Maggie and Anders, Emmeline have been, Anders died unfortunately, but super supportive. Marcin as well, David Pierce, Winslow Strong, more recently David Langer, and people who helped with the Amsterdam meetup. I want to mention like Teal. Joel Diaz, Noah Clark, Timo Torsten, George Fescher, Carl Heidensmith, Marco Aquil, of course, for making a presentation about divisive normalization and chaos at the event. Zios Tipado, Saidao, more broadly the psychedelic nexus, and long-term contributors like people like Scry and Symmetric Vision, Taru, Hirvonen, Emil Hall, Rudolf Balsers, and David Lobser, who developed Brain Candy and Cosmic Sugar. The people who are collaborating for doing studies with coupling kernels now in academia, including, in this project that's called Viscerality. Viscerality by George Fescher, Mesmer Prism, David Lobser, Taru, Symmetric Vision. Cyanidelica, who featured in the Amsterdam meetup by John Desnoyer Stewart. Contrast Features by Lodewij Liuja. Sorry for not exactly being able to pronounce that. And Til Holzapfel, who has been really helpful, especially as of late. And I also want to highlight Emil Hall because he has been really instrumental in advancing essentially this paradigm in what we're calling the replication tool, which you're gonna hear more about this, but essentially we're creating from scratch this really powerful engine to be able to replicate the visual and also down the line the tactile effects of different psychedelics with therapeutic applications as well as crazy artistic applications. I mean there's gonna be some events where I'm gonna be like DJing different trippy psychedelic patterns in combination with music at parties, and I think this is going to be a big deal. I mean, I think it's going to change how people in academia, in science, artists, meditators, how they think of different states of consciousness. I see a revolution coming. I'm calling it the coupling kernels revolution, which it's all fascinating and very exciting. So I guess the last thing is yes, please join us in the Q&A for the QRI Discord in a couple of days. More broadly, just interact with us in the QRI Discord. And the Cyberdelic Nexus is going to be essentially holding a wonderful event where they're going to be using the coupling kernels for decorating a really impressive artistic dome. And I'm going to put a link in the description about that, the Cyberdelic Society. We're collaborating with various other nonprofits and artist collectives to make this actually super awesome and mind-blowing as well. In other words, the first applications of like rigorous mathematics from first principles and taking phenomenology seriously to how to actually change the world, make it much better. So with that, thank you so much for sticking around and seeing this whole video. Infinite bliss, everybody, and I'll talk to you on another time on another topic. Take care, everybody.